Hello and welcome back to the Embedded Apprentice. My mastermind group last week, we challenged each other to do a video about how I taught myself to program and became a professional programmer. This is my video. Problem is, I probably learned to program before some of the people in my mastermind group were born. I learned to program on the Apple II, the original Apple II, in the 7th grade. I was lucky enough to get into a class, an extracurricular science class called Mindbenders, taught by Mrs. Bergevin at my middle school. And we learned BASIC on the Apple II. I loved it. I took to it. I would stay late. I would be in the computer lab at all times. You could play games. You could do graphics. It was amazing. So I wanted my own computer. Well, now, obviously, an Apple II costs a lot of money, more than my parents were willing to spend. But I convinced them, as part of the class, you had to do a year-long project. And the project that I got to do, that I convinced them to do, was this. Now, you may not recognize this. This is the Timex Sinclair ZX80 computer. We bought this as a kit for $99. And I built it myself, soldered it together. It didn't work. Didn't work first try. I believe it's because I probably put some of the chips in backwards the first time I powered it on, not knowing any better, not being aware. We sent it back into the factory, paid an extra $50 I think, and had it repaired. Sent back, and eventually it worked. So if you can see, maybe you can, maybe you can't, that's the keyboard. And you can see there are keywords above certain letters. This used a built-in BASIC interpreter. And I want to show you, I found this in the same box. This is the magazine you would get monthly when you bought the computer. And inside there was literally basic code on the pages, and you'd type it in. And on the side there was, you would take a standard cassette tape recorder, plug it into the side, and it had a modem chip that would just make the bleeps and blorts of a modem out to the tape, and then you could play the tape back in. Standard audio playing speed, and sometimes that would actually work. After I got out of middle school, went into high school, there were actually no computers in my high school. No computers at all. Instead, I got into a vocational electronics program. The vocational electronics was as close as it came to using a computer. We started out with electronics, Ohm's law, resistors, capacitors, and to give you an idea, this wasn't that long ago, to me at least, but it was long ago enough that we actually did a project, a whole, I don't know, semester's not the right word. We did a whole series of classes about tubes. We had the giant tube amplifiers and built tubes and looked at curves and how you'd build amplifiers from tubes that I don't think anybody even teaches anymore. So went to college, got an electrical engineering degree and a minor in computer science. Now anybody who's a professional programmer knows programming in college is very different from programming in the real world. Everything we did in college was in Pascal. That's the beginning and end of that story. If you've programmed Pascal, that was just funny. But I never did the programming. And when I graduated from college, the first George Bush, we were having what he called a recession, and that was a new word to America, the word recession. What it meant was, when I got into college 4 years earlier, engineers were hot. You could get a job right out of college for more money than your dad made. When I graduated, you couldn't get arrested. There were just no jobs. So I wound up, because I had gone through vocational electronics in high school, I could solder, I could do troubleshooting and repairs. I had more than just book learning. I got a job as a technician at a tiny company in Boulder, Colorado, making water quality instruments. It was a company called Sievers Instruments. And that was a great experience because it was a tiny company. And my entire experience up to that point, in college they pushed, you're going to be an engineer at HP, you're going to go to DEC, you're going to go to a big company and work on big things at the big company. And suddenly here I was in a company that had 12 people in it. And you had to just build stuff. You just had to do stuff. I just had They gave me a big box full of boards that had died or didn't even live when they got here. They said, okay, we've got to ship 10 units. Mix, match, do whatever you have to do, get 10 sets of electronics. And that's what I did. Eventually, that job played itself out. Went on to another job where I was the first employee at a startup. And this company was making industrial flow meters. So you have a giant pipe in your factory. You would put this flow meter in there, and it would measure the liquid, water, steam, whatever was flowing through the pipe. And this was another great experience because there were 3 people. I was the first employee. We had the founder, who was the flow meter guy, me, who did the electronics, and a incredibly gifted machinist and welder. We eventually had to hire another electronics person to help me out. There were 5 individual boards in the system. A great experience. We did it all. We started from just diagrams on a whiteboard and started working and had a product. This job kind of evolved till I was the guy who was doing a lot. So I'd written the database that we kept our part numbers in. I'd written the system that we used to test all the boards and test the stuff. So we had travelers that went with each unit, and all that went into a database, and all this was in Visual Basic and Access and went into a big MS Access database. So I don't want to call that professional programming. By this time it was 2000, and engineering was hot again. There was a company in Silicon Valley that was giving you a free 2-year lease on a BMW. That was the signing bonus. 2 years free ownership of a BMW. And what had happened was I started dating a young lady who's now my wife, and she was in a job that was not going anywhere and wanted to find a new job. But she couldn't search the internet for jobs while at work. So I was looking around on the internet for jobs for her while I was at work. And of course, if you're on monster.com, what do? You type in, well, engineering jobs. And realize that my boss at this startup was getting an amazing deal to have somebody like me who was there 6 days a week, who was doing manufacturing, kitting boards, building boards, testing boards, doing design work, doing test fixtures, doing software, doing FPGA work. And he wasn't paying me what I could get out on the market. So I started looking, and I got almost a 50% pay raise to move to a larger company also in Boulder. And this is, I think, where I really became a professional. Because what I did at the flow metering company, I hadn't done the firmware. That was one job that I just didn't have time for with all the other things that I was doing. So the boss, the founder, Jim, he wrote all the firmware that went into the device. And we worked together on pieces of it, but mostly it was him writing it. So I took his copy of KNR, the C programming language, which I recommend as the book on how C programming should work, and I read it in about 3 days before the interview. And I went to the interview, and of course I had a number of interviews all over. It was hard to find people at that time. Went through a full day of interviewing and was able to answer all these questions at a company that was doing wireless phones that worked over 802.11 networks and networking stuff. And they needed somebody to work on networking. And quite honestly, I kind of bluffed about 50% of the way through the interview. I did know enough C to get by. I had worked on the firmware, but I hadn't written the whole thing, and I tried to give them the impression that, yeah, I'd written probably more than I should. But I later learned that they hired me because I was so cheap, I was asking so little in salary, that even if I didn't work out, if I got anything done at all, it would be totally worth hiring me. So I was lucky enough to have a couple of job offers, and their interview was really hard, really tough. Walked home exhausted. And I took the job with the company that gave me the toughest interview because I figured these are the kind of people that I want to work with. Turns out that was a good job. I learned so much. I learned how to really program in C. They had a product that was a gateway that did the voice protocol that the phones spoke over the network, and then would translate that and connect to a PBX system, so a phone system for an office or a building. And this was running this odd little, it was based on BSD, but it was some open source project that a guy had been using to do packetized radio for ham. And the first guy who had started it had got it up and running, and it would run, and it was not too bad, but it had a lot of bugs. And in this kernel, if they check for null once, I'll give you a nickel. It was not pretty, which was the perfect environment for me to learn. It had its own timer system. It had its own memory allocation, its own networking stack. And because it was just a little buggy and was crashy, myself, the team that I worked with, we went through it with a fine-tooth comb again and again and again. We just had a big whiteboard with all the bugs written on the whiteboard, and every day or every week you'd cross off a couple of bugs till finally, you get to the end and you'd have to erase the whole thing and put up the new bug list. And that was how we did project management. But it was a great environment because I got to see all this stuff and learn all this and get to the point where I could just write C, and C was now my native tongue that I could work in and prefer to work in. Since that time, I've gone on and worked at a number of other companies, a couple of other startups, doing programming, doing some Linux stuff. But that was really the formative experience where I learned TCP/IP networking for real. I worked with it at a low level, refactored the Ethernet driver about 3 times so it would survive ping attacks and broadcast floods. Wrote a DHCP client for the gateway that was native to the gateway because it was its own weird little thing that had its own weird little operating system. And I wouldn't trade that experience for the world, and the people I worked with there were pretty awesome too. So that's my story. And that's how I got to be the embedded apprentice and learn all these cool things. But you got to start somewhere, and this is a good place to start. If you're starting out now, I would recommend starting here. This is a great board. We did a great meetup about it just a couple of days ago. I want to thank you for listening to Embedded Apprentice, and check out embeddedapprentice.com and look at the blog, or subscribe to this YouTube channel. Thank you.